George Washington. George Washington was the most powerful man in America. The general who crossed the Delaware, crushed the British, and became the nation's first president was revered like a living god. When he finally retired to his beloved Mount Vernon estate, Americans believed he would live forever. He didn't even make it to the new century. On December 12, 1799, Washington spent hours riding his horse in freezing rain and snow to inspect his farm. He went to bed that night with a sore throat. By the next morning, he could barely breathe. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and his doctors were summoned. What happened next is nothing short of murder by medicine. Washington's physicians applied the standard treatment of the era, bloodletting. Over the course of roughly 12 hours on December 13th and 14th, 1799, they drained an estimated 5 to 9 pints of blood from the 67-year-old man's body. That is more than half the blood in a human being. In between bleedings, they gave him mercury to make him vomit and applied blisters to his skin. Washington, who had survived 8 years of war and countless battlefields, was being slowly killed by the men trying to save him. At approximately 10:20 p.m. on December 14th, 1799, George Washington took his last breath. His final words were reported as, "'Tis well." His body lay in state at Mount Vernon, and the nation went into mourning. Congress adjourned. Black armbands were worn across the country. The father of the nation, a man who had outrun British bullets for decades, was killed in less than 48 hours by a sore throat and his own doctors. He was 67 years old. Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton built the financial system of the United States from nothing. As the first Secretary of the Treasury, he created the National Bank, established the credit system, and shaped the economic engine that would power a superpower. He was brilliant, fierce, and feared. And then a man he had insulted one too many times decided he had lived long enough. Aaron Burr, the sitting vice president of the United States, challenged Hamilton to a duel after Hamilton made disparaging remarks about him during a New York governor's race. Hamilton accepted. The two men had clashed for years, but this was different. This was personal. Some accounts suggest Hamilton privately intended not to fire at Burr, perhaps hoping to resolve the matter with honor intact. On the morning of July 11, 1804, Hamilton and Burr met at a dueling ground in Weehawken, New Jersey, across the Hudson River from Manhattan. They stood 10 paces apart. The signal was given. Burr fired. The ball struck Hamilton in the lower abdomen, passed through his liver, and lodged in his spine. Hamilton collapsed immediately. He was rowed back across the river, barely conscious, in tremendous pain. He lingered through the night and into the following day, suffering greatly, attended by doctors who could do nothing for a wound like that. At 2 p.m. on July 12, 1804, Alexander Hamilton died. The nation was stunned. Aaron Burr, the Vice President of the United States, was indicted for murder in both New York and New Jersey. He fled south and finished his term in disgrace. His political career finished forever. One of America's greatest minds, the architect of its entire financial system, was shot dead by the second highest official in his own government. He was 49 years old. John Adams. John Adams was the last link, the second president of the United States, the man who had stood in the Continental Congress and argued fiercely for independence when others hesitated, was now 90 years old, the longest-lived founding father. He had outlasted almost everyone he had ever known. His wife Abigail was gone. His rivals were gone. The entire generation that had built the Republic had turned to dust. On the morning of July 4th, 1826, John Adams was dying. For weeks, his health had been in sharp decline. He was confined to his bed at his home in Quincy, Massachusetts, barely able to speak or swallow. His family surrounded him. As the nation below him celebrated 50 years of independence with cannon fire and bells, John Adams lay upstairs fighting for each breath. Through the day, he faded. In the early afternoon, he stirred one final time. His last words were reported as 4 words. Thomas Jefferson survives. Then John Adams died. It was approximately 6:20 in the afternoon of July 4th, 1826. He never knew what he was wrong about. Jefferson had died 5 hours earlier at Monticello, 500 miles to the south. The two men, who had been rivals for years and then reconciled into one of history's great friendships through thousands of letters, died on the same day, the 50th anniversary of the nation they had built together. The odds of this happening by chance have been calculated as astronomically small. When news reached Washington, people reportedly wept in the streets. Newspapers called it a miracle or an act of providence. The nation struggled to absorb the idea that two men so central to its birth had been taken simultaneously on its 50th birthday. John Adams spent his last conscious moment thinking of his old friend. He died not knowing that friend had already gone. He was 90 years old. Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry lit the fire. His speech to the Virginia Convention in 1775, ending with the words, "Give me liberty or give me death," electrified the colonies and helped push a hesitant population toward revolution. He was five-term governor of Virginia, the most powerful orator of the founding era, and a man whose words moved entire crowds to tears and rage. His voice had helped start a war. That voice went silent long before his time. In his final years, Patrick Henry had retired to his plantation in Red Hill, Virginia. He was suffering from intussusception, a painful condition in which part of the intestine folds into itself, causing obstruction, severe pain, and eventually death. There was no surgical remedy in 1799. His doctor gave him liquid mercury, the standard treatment, in a final attempt to clear the obstruction. On June 6, 1799, Henry was given the mercury mixture. He reportedly said a quiet prayer, pulled his cap down over his eyes, and lay still. Within minutes, he was gone. His death was peaceful at the end, but the weeks leading to it had been weeks of severe abdominal pain with no relief available. He died at his home surrounded by family on a warm, early summer day. He was buried that same day at Red Hill, in a simple grave under a cedar tree on his own property. His tombstone read, "His fame, his best epitaph." No grand state funeral, no lying in state, just a quiet burial on the land he loved. The man who had cried for liberty died in quiet agony from a condition a modern surgeon could fix in an hour. He was 63 years old. James Monroe. James Monroe was the last president who had fought in the Revolutionary War. The man with a bullet still lodged near his shoulder from the Battle of Trenton, who had stood in that freezing boat crossing the Delaware beside Washington, who had served as president during what historians called the era of good feelings. He was the final soldier president of the founding generation. He died broke, alone in New York City, far from his Virginia home. Monroe's final years were defined by financial ruin. He had spent his own personal fortune serving his country across decades of diplomatic and presidential service and had never been properly compensated. His Virginia estate Ashlawn was sold to pay debts. After his wife Elizabeth died in 1830, Monroe moved to New York to live with his daughter Maria. His health began to fail rapidly. He developed tuberculosis and heart problems simultaneously. On July 4, 1831, James Monroe died at his daughter's home in New York City. He was the third founding father to die on July 4th, following Jefferson and Adams exactly 5 years earlier to the day. His death on Independence Day was widely reported as providential, as though the founders were being called home on the birthday of the nation they had created. He was the last president of the revolutionary generation. With his death, a direct human link to the men who had fired muskets at the British, who had shivered at Valley Forge, who had signed their names to documents that could have gotten them hanged, was gone forever. His body was returned to Virginia years later and interred at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. He had died nearly penniless, his fortune consumed by his country. 3 founding fathers died on July 4th. The odds of that happening by chance are so small they have never been fully explained. He was 73 years old.